Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is the aftermath of World War II, aka the origins of the Cold War. Before we begin, as always, take a moment, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. Now let's get started. Now we left off with World War II. We're going to wrap that up today. And again, I'm not going to get into the weeds of World War II anymore. And again, use your textbook, read about it in there. But we got to talk about a few things that are important because the reality is that that moment that we dropped the atomic bomb is almost basically the moment that we start a new war, known as the Cold War. And so this lecture today is setting up the next, 40 plus years of history. Now, officially, if you go on Wikipedia and you Google it really quick, and Cold War, it's going to say somewhere in 1948, 1949, somewhere around there. The Cold War officially begins. But realize that it's a fluid date. And it begins pretty much in 1945 as the war is winding down. And it will last all the way until basically 1990. So let's pick up right here and contextualize what's happening leading up to the dropping the atomic bomb. So let's start right here, the Cold War. And it begins here in 1945 in February with the big three. You have FDR, you have Winston Churchill, and of course, Joseph Stalin. And you can see here, FDR is a little older, as is Churchill. And they gather together to talk about what a post-war world looks like. You see, by 1945, Germany is falling. And everyone knows it. Hitler hasn't quite given up yet, but it's over. And so now the question is, what do you do next? How do you, A, get peace? And then B, how do we prevent a future world war like this? Now, these three men are sitting here smiling, great photo op, right? None of them trusted each other. Well, let me phrase that. Churchill and FDR were pretty well trusted friends, or allies at least. But Stalin had always been an ally of convenience. And this conference only underscores that. In this conference, he said he was very arrogant. He was very demanding, very self-confident. But again, this is a marriage of necessity between the communism and democracy. Now, at this conference, FDR has two major concerns. The first is to make sure that when the war in Europe is over, that the Soviet Union will help in the fight against the Japanese. That's the first goal. Second goal is that they want to create a new world organization held in the United States that will, of course, prevent all future wars. Now, of course, we know that this will become known as the United Nations. That was, first, second goal there. They also decided, though, what the new world should look like. And what they decided, they hammered out, these leaders, was what do you do with Germany after this? You see Germany on your screen right now. And they decided that they would take the nation of Germany and they would divide it east from west. And basically the Soviet Union would get the eastern half, spoils of war. And the other allied powers, France, US, Britain, will control the western half of Germany. And basically the Soviet Union gets the east, the Western allies get the western half, which is also the industry-rich half. So good for them. And they decided, though, that the city of Berlin right here, would also be subdivided. So the capital city of Berlin, which is firmly in the eastern half of Germany, would also be divided between the Allies in a very similar manner. Eastern half of Berlin controlled by the Soviets, and the western half by the Allies. Now, originally it was divided into three colors, three sections by the three Allies. Eventually it becomes the Allied zone. Oh, and one more thing, very important, the big three. They also agreed that both sides, so Stalin agrees too, that he will sponsor free elections, democratic governments, and constitutional safeguards with freedom throughout Europe for all these freed nations after the war's over. Yeah. That lasts about 30 seconds. But Stalin agreed, so hey. But again, by 1945, the Axis power is collapsing. Mussolini was captured. He was publicly executed by anti-fascists in Italy. In Berlin, Hitler secretly married his mistress in an underground bunker, and then they proceeded to both kill themselves. And finally, on May 8th, 1945, we have VE Day. Very fancy term, for stands for Victory in Europe, VE. And on May 8th, 1945, we have VE Day. The war is over in Europe. However, in the midst of this victory came a startling, troubling realization of just how bad the Holocaust had been. I mean, there was reports, but again, it's one thing to hear, oh, they're killing thousands of people. They're killing tens of thousands of people. You hear that, but it's just numbers. But as the Allied armies approached Germany and Poland, they approached these death camps. They got their first visceral look at the horrific atrocities. And in the midst of this horribleness, some estimates range, but majority of estimates, right around 11 million people were killed in the Holocaust. At least 6 million were of Jewish descent. We knew about this. We heard about it. In fact, Jewish refugees were knocking on our door trying to get in. And because of the Depression, and because of anti-Semitism and racism and anti-immigration nativism, we refused. FDR made a modest attempt to relocate some, but generally speaking, we allowed in very few. And the result was this. And the thing is, our generals, including future President Dwight D. Eisenhower, one of the hero generals of World War II, one person in charge of D-Day. As the tanks and soldiers began to go into these concentration camps, these death camps, one of the first things Eisenhower did was what he said was, go get a camera. We need to record this for posterity. Because if we don't record this with video and camera, people will never believe it. They will deny it ever happened. And sure enough, there are people today that deny the Holocaust happened. It happened. More than 11 million people dead. More than half of them Jewish descent. Gypsies, homosexuals, twins, communists. On the other hand, FDR never lived to see VE Day. Even at Yalta, it was evident he was a very sick man. On April 12th, just under a month before the war ended in Europe, he's going to die during his 4th term in office. The nation mourned his loss. Sad to see their president dead. And we have a new president, his vice president, Harry S. Truman, which, fun fact, his middle name is just S. But Harry Truman was an interesting person that no one knew much about in 1945. Now, just for, make sure you understand the date-wise. So, FDR was elected in 1932. He was reelected in 36. He went for an unprecedented third term in 1940, given the war coming, and won. And then was also reelected a fourth time in 1944. Now, you may know that you don't have to keep the same vice president every time you run for president. You can change. And in 1944, Franklin Delano Roosevelt changed his running mate. He changed his vice president candidate when he won again. So in 1944, inaugurated January of 45, in April of 45, the new vice president, who's only been in office for 3 months, is now the president. And he was a fairly obscure person. He was a senator from Missouri, which is pretty much all Democrat senator from Missouri. That was pretty much all that FDR cared about. Why? Because FDR was from New York. FDR needed to secure those southern white racist Democrats. He needed their votes to pass his stuff, pass their bills. And in order to get the southern conservative Democrats, he chose a southerner to be his running mate. In fact, funny story, when Truman was told that FDR had selected him to be the new vice president for the new election, Truman's response to FDR was, quote, "Tell him to go to hell," unquote. FDR yelled back at him, saying that he had already made up his mind and that Truman had no choice in the matter. He said, quote, "If he, Truman, wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of a war and maybe lose that war, it's up to him." So Truman signed on, and probably having no idea that basically 3 months after inauguration, he would become president. Now, Truman's not a bad guy. When FDR died, he immediately went to Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife, and said, "Eleanor, quote, is there anything I can do for you?" Unquote. I mean, he's being kind, right? She's lost her husband. Eleanor responded saying, quote, "Is there anything we can do for you? You are the one in trouble now," unquote. Again, you gotta love Eleanor. Nonetheless, Harry Truman, he is now president. He inherits a victory in Europe because, again, less than 1 month later, they will have VE Day. But there's still the issue of Japan and the Pacific. And Truman knows that it's a big issue. It's going to be very costly, both in terms of money and American lives. And again, the fun stories keep coming about Harry Truman because Harry Truman was not trusted by FDR. He was left out of FDR's inner circle. So when he becomes president in April of 45, he has to be brought up to speed quickly. Like, "Hey, sir, there's all these things you didn't know about because FDR didn't trust you, you weren't part of the inner circle, so let's get you up to speed and tell you what's going on here." Including things like, I don't know, negotiations between the big three. Like, he has no idea about this whole, these backdoor deals between Stalin and Churchill and himself, and Roosevelt. Oh, and then there's another thing. What was the other thing he was told about? Oh, yeah, that's right. This $2 billion Manhattan Project. That was the brainchild of Albert Einstein, trying to create the atomic bomb, right? Yeah. Truman had no idea. It was a super secret project that he had no idea about. He was on a need-to-know basis, and he didn't need to know. And so he inherits this victory in the Pacific, in Europe. He has a war to fight in the Pacific, and he has a brand new toy, the atomic bomb. Here's a picture of Einstein Oppenheimer. That's being tested throughout the country in various places, and each area only produced one part of it as part of the secrecy. They didn't want enemies to find out about it. They didn't want even each other to find out. They wanted to keep it a super secret project, which they did. And so he's like, "Wow, we have a bomb? Sweet." And so one of the test sites right there, by the way. And here's what it looks like when it goes off. You see the mushroom cloud in 0.016 seconds. You get that. Again, this is intense. This is big, right? This is huge. And what's funny about the story is that Truman got to attend his first major conference, global conference, with Churchill and Stalin. And Truman was like, hey, do you guys know we have this really cool new weapon called the atomic bomb? It could totally annihilate the Japanese. And Stalin's like, yeah, I already knew about this. Yeah, Stalin knew about it too. Not because he was trusted by FDR, but because he had spies on the United States. Stalin didn't even flinch when Truman told him about the atomic bomb because he already knew it, thanks to his spy network in the United States. So now you have this problem, right? If you're Harry Truman. On the one hand, you do traditional warfare. Now, traditional warfare, remember, we've done this island hopping strategy from a couple lectures ago. We have now reached Okinawa, and we have now launched a place where we can now launch an invasion on mainland Japan. But here's the thing. Japan's a very mountainous nation. And so if you storm the beaches of Japan, you're essentially going for D-Day 2.0. You have to storm the beaches, climb the mountains, and take the high ground from the Japanese. And you're dealing with a culture, the military culture, nationalism infused with old samurai ideas, that they will not surrender. Which means you're going to risk thousands, if not tens of thousands or millions of lives, risking a land invasion. Knowing that even if you succeed, they might not surrender for years. On the other hand, you have this new bomb that some American scientists are estimating that if you drop it, about 20,000 people will die. Now, they're a little off here by a lot, but this was the moral quandary for Harry Truman. Do you risk a land invasion, which will A, prolong the war, B, be extremely costly in terms of money, and C, risk tens of thousands of American lives, soldiers? Or do you drop this new bomb that some people are telling you may only kill 20,000 people? That will include civilians, but they're Japanese, so they're not American. What do you do? Now, impressively, Harry Truman, very proudly when he announced his decision to drop the atomic bomb, he very famously always said, the buck stops here. He took full responsibility as president. And so they began training. And of course, the Enola Gay was the name of the plane that drops the first bomb on Hiroshima. And the second one, by the way, the second bomber was named Boxcar. Fun little fact. So rather than launch a costly invasion of Japan, Truman orders the dropping of the atomic bomb. This is untested as far as on actual cities. And it was a complete and utter devastation. Instantly, 4 square miles were completely leveled on August 6, 1945. Those some scientists who said 20,000 dead, up to 150,000 people died instantaneously. And then, just 2 days later, we dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki, killing another 80,000 people instantly. And that's not counting the survivors. These survivors are stuck in a wasteland, walking the streets. And as the radiation poisoning sets in, their skin is literally just falling and flaking off their bodies. The death toll continued to rise over the next weeks and months as radiation poisoning began to kill some more, taking the toll even years later as children are born deformed, missing limbs, missing organs, due to radiation poisoning from the fallout. Now, I'm not going to show you the pictures of the skin falling off. I'm going to show you this. This is a satellite overhead imagery of Hiroshima before and after the bomb. On the left, before, and the right, after. 70,000 buildings were annihilated. You went from looking like a major metropolitan city on the left to what looks like the grasslands, the plains of the United States, the farmlands. The buildings are gone. This is how powerful that bomb is. That's Hiroshima. Here's Nagasaki. You're talking more than 230,000 people dead like that. Not to mention hundreds of thousands in the next days, weeks, months, years. Now, it was ultimately Japan would not surrender until September 2nd, 1945. But what cost? Yes, it saved American lives. It did. Truman made the decision to drop the atomic bomb to save lives and money. But the nuclear genie was out of the bottle. In following World War II, the world's going to struggle to rebuild. The powers of Europe, Germany, France, Great Britain, had once dominated the world for centuries, are now left in ruins. The war has wreaked a terrible toll on them. In their place, there are two new superpowers: the United States, the Soviet Union. It doesn't take long before the Soviet Union begins to expand its power into Eastern Europe. That whole uneasy alliance between the Soviet Union and the West is gone. Crumbles as soon as the war is over. Now, to be fair, the Soviet Union was also devastated by the war. Much of the fight had happened on their land. But they have the resources and the number of people to rebuild. And the thing was, they have the people to throw at the problem. The rest of Europe, they're devastated. They don't have any military left to speak of that can stop Stalin and stop the Soviet Union. Only the U.S. can. Only the U.S. has the economic and military means to stop Stalin after World War II. And thus, Truman declares that there's a new struggle for power, aka the Cold War. Churchill, of course, very eloquently put it a different way, saying that, quote, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. This is not a real, literal curtain, but there's a iron curtain all the way down, separating us from them, democracy from communism. And this begins what's known as the Cold War. Why is it cold? It's called cold because, technically speaking, the US and Soviet Union never directly attacked each other. It's a war between the Soviets and the Americans. But they never actually fight each other. Because if they did, that's World War III, it's nuclear war, everyone's dead. But rather, the Cold War is a war of ideas. A struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union to expand power, influence. It's a contest between democratic capitalism and totalitarian communism. Now, to be sure, there are hot points in the Cold War. Vietnam, Korea. But the US and Soviet Union never went to actual war. Rather, for the next 45 years, there will be the threat of a looming war that will hang over the world. By the early 50s, the Soviets developed their own nuclear arsenal, launching an arms race between the US and the Soviet Union. In other words, let's build up our military and build more and more bombs to make sure that if we ever do go to war, the world is over. And the question is, how does the US respond to this? And Truman responds with force. He responds in kind. And so, but Truman realizes this is not just a military struggle. He knows it's a struggle of ideas, a struggle of economies. He also looks at Europe and says, Europe's in trouble. Because Great Britain, they are not what they once were. France is devastated. Germany's gone. Italy is in shambles. Spain was fascist. So they're in shambles as well. And traditionally, Great Britain and France were able to help other European nations stave off communism. But in the wake of World War II, there's no help for them anymore. So let me give you a direct example. In the post-war period, in 1947, in Greece and Turkey, the two nations here, you see them down here on the bottom, right there, they are in dire straits. They are bankrupt. Their government's on the verge of collapse. Now, traditionally, Britain would step in and be able to pump money into them, help them shore up their governments, and prevent a communist takeover. Because you got to realize, if your government is failing, you are ready to look for a new type of government. And communism was still a relatively new thing that many people believed could solve some answers. And so the fear was, because remember, there were some strong Communist Party presence in both these countries, Greece and Turkey. The fear was, though, that if the United States didn't step up, there may be what was called a domino effect. Whereas, so Soviet Union comes in, they offer help to the Communist Party in Turkey, and bam, they turn communist. And then bam, Greece does too. But those become the first two dominoes to fall as it keeps going all the way across Europe, eventually engulfing places like Great Britain and France. So how do you stop this? Well, Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine became our foreign policy that pretty much, well, in many respects is still going on. Harry Truman, his strategy to deal with the Soviet Union into Western affairs was to basically provide economic aid to foreign countries to prevent the hostile takeover of foreign governments. Sound familiar? And so in March of 1947, he's going to deliver a speech to Congress, warning Congress that to preserve democracy, capitalism, and the American way of life, the Soviets must be stopped from expanding. And basically, he asked for $400 million in military and economic aid for Greece and Turkey. Now, to get this, Congress is not going to say yes to it, so he scares the ever-living crap out of Americans, saying that this is your tomorrow. If you do not give money to Greece and Turkey and prevent the dominoes from starting to fall. So Truman begins to broadly define the threat to America. Basically, communism replaced fascism and Nazism. So we fought from 1941, 1945 against fascism and Nazism. Well, by 1947, we have a new foe. It's communism. And so this broad definition gives him a broad strokes of being able to depict an us versus them mentality. That there are two separate worlds. There's a free people and an enslaved people. There is the free people, the democratically elected capitalist economy, and then there's the totalitarian communism that will just enslave you basically and kill you. And of course, this is going to lead to our next lecture about when you scare the crap out of Americans, they turn to try to find some semblance of order. And they will. That's next lecture. And so the rationale for this now is that the Truman Doctrine leads to an open-ended struggle against communism. That the world is in shambles, especially Europe, and the United States is the only one that can step in, and prevent the hostile takeover of communism in places like West Germany, Italy, France. The question is, this is the strategy now. We got a strategy. How do you actually implement this militarily and politically? We have our strategy. Stop communism. prevent it from taking over new countries. But how do you actually do that in practice? We'll talk about that in the second half of this lecture. So take a break, come back for the second half, but until then, take care, and bye-bye.